Hello, welcome to Wild Cities, the podcast. I'm your host, Chris Fitch, author of the book Wild Cities. It's pretty exciting. I came back last week to say that I had done an interview and there was going to be a new podcast episode, and I can say basically the same thing again this week. But this was a very exciting opportunity I had to go for the first time on BBC Radio 4 to be on the show Rare Earth, which, if you're not familiar, talks about environmental issues, nature, and how do we live more sustainably in the world. And they were doing an episode all about urban wildlife, or generally about nature in cities, and so understandably they looked at me as the author of Wild Cities, a book that came out quite recently, just 6 months ago, and decided that I might have something interesting to say. And I thought that the people that I've got subscribed to this podcast, all about the book Wild Cities, might be interested to know what we talked about on this show. I will say first off that, of course, I'm super grateful that I was invited. Tom and Helen, the hosts of Rare Earth, speak to incredibly knowledgeable people all the time, loads of different subjects that they get into. They themselves are so knowledgeable, they have so many interesting thoughts, and that was exactly the case with this show. And as you'll hear, the other guests, or the other two panelists who were there throughout, Dawn and Sian, also very knowledgeable. I mean, in a very different way than myself. They have done much more on-the-ground research, as you'll hear, rather than my sort of exploring the world type, finding stories way of investigating urban nature as a subject matter. It was just wonderful to be able to be part of this conversation on such a high-profile platform. And I'll admit that I was a bit starstruck. I mean, listening back to the edit, there are definitely parts where I can find myself thinking, just give a bit more detail. You know so much more about this, or you are so much more well-informed than you kind of sounding a bit stilted, but you should be able to speak confidently about this. And if I get the opportunity to go on this show again, or other Radio 4 shows, maybe I'll have that opportunity to be that little bit more relaxed and give a little bit more information without feeling like I had to be quite so careful of every word that I said. I mean, if you listen to the episode, then you can hear that later on in the show, I definitely started to feel a bit more comfortable and was able to give a bit more detail about what I was saying and to interact a bit more with the presenters. So it was a really good learning experience for me. But anyway, back to the main point. I was on Rare Earth. It was a wonderful opportunity. I imagine that people who have subscribed to this channel would be interested to hear the show. Of course, it exists as its own podcast, and I'll put a link in the description. But since you're already subscribed to this one, I thought I'd put it straight out and share with all of you. So thank you for supporting Wild Cities, the podcast. Thank you for buying the book, or reading the book, or in any way that you might have engaged with this project. I'm so privileged to have been able to do so. I'll take an opportunity again just to squeeze in a quick thanks to the Society of Authors and to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, who both funded a lot of my research. But just to focus on what we're doing right now, BBC Radio 4's Rare Earth. Here I am as a panelist. Hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to Rare Earth, Radio 4's weekly delve into the environment. Today we are going to be focusing on our own backyard, so to speak. We're looking at wildlife, but not the sort that you go to nature reserves or on safaris or watch extremely exotic documentaries to see. This is the sort that you probably pass every single day on your way to work without even thinking about it. Today we are talking about urban wildlife. So Tom, what sort of encounters with urban wildlife do you have?
I was a student in London, and I lived up a little bit into the northwest towards Kilburn. And when it was night time and I felt a little bit maverick, I used to get there by hopping the fence in Regent's Park and going into Regent's Park at night.
Right.
And certainly when you got in there and to the other side, you felt like you were in a different world. You could hear the sounds of the animals. You could feel the sort of distant city, but feeling the immediate cocooning around you was about wildlife. And that was really exciting. So that's what has just occurred to me.
You escaped into the wild world right in the heart of London.
Yeah.
But even if you don't live next to a massive park, I am constantly amazed by the little pockets of wildlife around cities. These little pockets of grass and trees and bushes, and you can see birds hopping about and squirrels. People go to those places. They go and sit there to eat their lunch. They choose to walk by them. So there's clearly, even in a city where we're not expecting any wildlife, we do like to see the animals.
And one of the reasons why urban wildlife matters is because more and more of us are living in cities. So if we want wildlife encounters, it's helpful if they're on our doorstep. It's reckoned now that 55% of the world's population live in an urban area, and that proportion is only going up. I was really impressed by a project that I've heard about recently in Leamington Spa, which is a town not that far from me, where they're trying to create what they call the Leamington Sky Garden. And what this is an area of old railway viaducts that no longer have a railway on them, going right through the heart of the town. And they want to open them up for public access in order, just as you say, for people to walk about in, have their lunch in, go and have a chat and meet people in. There is a slight irony in this, which we'll get into in the show, which is, what is urban wildlife space for? Is it for wildlife or is it for us? Because actually the truth is, at the moment, those viaducts are thoroughly overgrown and are probably sort of at a peak for wildlife. When we put a bit of access in there, that might diminish. So that balance is going to be something I think we'll get into.
Yeah. The time I see people interacting most with wildlife in London is at the ponds where the ducks are, because everybody loves watching the ducks. And the thing about watching the ducks is that if you go regularly, you start to pick out which populations of ducks get on with each other, which are having a little fight, who's looking after the territory, which are the calm birds that don't really mind, and which are the really grumpy ones that are always cross if someone comes near them. And it becomes this massive soap opera. But it's something that you have to actually sit and watch. And I think that's really interesting. A city where we're in a hurry, we're going somewhere. It's one of the things where it's nice to be there, but if you sit, the benefit keeps growing. You sort of see this drama that's right there.
I love that. We better move on to introduce our panel. We have Dawn Scott, who is Executive Dean for the School of Animal, Rural and Environmental Sciences at Nottingham Trent University.
Sian Moxon is with us. She's an architect, the Associate Professor of Sustainable Architecture at London Metropolitan University and founder of the campaign group Rewild My Street.
And we have Chris Fitch joining us from Lisbon in Portugal, author of Wild Cities, a book which explores ways of living in what he describes as the modern urban jungle.
So to start off, I am very keen to know from each of you what your favourite urban creature or perhaps encounter is, something that really brings all this to life for you. Sian, why don't you go first?
So I'm going to pick the urban fox because I live in London, and although I see them fairly regularly, every time I do, I'm stopped in my tracks because it's amazing that such a kind of large, glamorous mammal lives amongst us.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody describe a fox as glamorous, but
they're gorgeous, yeah. Often unnoticed, undetected. And I know from my street WhatsApp group that foxes are a divisive species, can be. And indeed, in my own garden, I spend a lot of my time trying to outfox foxes, trying to stop them digging up things I don't want, chewing things I don't want. But they tend to always triumph, so you have to admire that. When I see their puppy dog eyes, I can forgive it.
Chris, how about you? What are your favourite urban animals or encounters?
I'm going to pick a specific encounter I had in Munich. I was told, basically, go down the river and you will find beavers. And so I went down there at the right time, which was kind of dusk, people heading home after work, and waited for ages and ages and ages. And I was about to give up and suddenly just spotted this gigantic thing. They're so much bigger than you'd expect, very silently moving up the river. A beaver the size of a Labrador, I'd say. And I just had this overwhelming feeling of wanting to scream and sort of grab all the people who were just walking around, staring at their phones around me and say, look, there's a huge animal in the river here in the city.
And Dawn, what about your favourite animal meeting?
So there's so many to choose from, but I'm going to have to choose the urban badger. And the reason for this is when you come across a badger in a street at night, it looks at you as if to say, what are you doing here? I've had loads of surprises with badgers in cities.
I don't think I've ever seen. Which cities have you seen badgers in?
So we did a lot of research in Brighton, and there's lots of badgers in Brighton. So you're walking around the streets at night and you just come across a badger, and it's a little bit disconcerting. But they're such characters. I really love them.
One of my neighbours got on the news because she discovered a badger in her shower. A little too close for comfort, that one.
It's really interesting to me that you all picked quite large animals, things that are bigger than you might expect. And of course, in principle, they're easiest to see. So they're the ones you're most likely to come across. We sort of assume that the only things that can survive in a city must be tiny little things living in the crevices somewhere where no one's looking. But actually, apparently, there's some quite big things out there.
How important is urban wildlife? I'll start off with, I think, Dawn on this one. How important is urban wildlife?
So we can think about urban wildlife from sort of two perspectives. We can think of it from an ecological point of view. So an urban area is an ecosystem. It needs wildlife to be able to function. So wildlife provides all sorts of things for you.
I'm sorry to interrupt you straight away, but most people would think, why does an urban system need wildlife in order to function?
So we also have lots of plants. We need pollinators. We have lots of different types of animals, including things like rats, which is part of urban wildlife, but people might see it as a potential pest. And things like foxes and badgers, they eat these things. So it's a functioning ecosystem. Just because we've created it to help us in terms of our human population in our habitats, it doesn't mean that it isn't essential to have wildlife there as well for that water, clean air, and that sort of ecosystem services that they provide.
So, Sian, go on.
I also think it's really important to have wildlife and nature in cities for people, because having that connection with nature is really important for our health and well-being. But also, as our cities change with climate change, it's going to help us with climate change resilience.
So how might it help us?
Having more vegetation means we get shade and shelter from hotter, drier summers, and cooling from green and blue spaces, water as well. And also helps to soak up lots of excess rainwater, so reducing flood risk, which with extreme weather events is going to become more and more of an issue.
Chris, Fitch, I wonder if you could sort of help out at all on the sort of quantification of the wildlife. How much urban wildlife is there?
More than you would expect, I suppose, is the short answer. And as we've already highlighted, you have a huge range of the big animals that we just mentioned at the top of the show, and foxes and badgers, but then going down to those invertebrates that...
So insects, basically.
Yes. The importance of cities for many insects and pollinators is actually surprisingly high, because in so much of what we might think of as their natural habitat out in the countryside, it's actually quite hard for a lot of them to survive because it can be so heavily industrialized. Actually, a lot of them find refuge in the city. It's sort of backwards to how you might think it would be. When you have proper urban rewilding projects, that can be true for birds, for wildflowers, all manner of different species that are sort of struggling to find a place to survive, and surprisingly find it in cities.
So what counts as wildlife? Is this any plant life or any animal life at all? What about the rats and the pigeons and the things that people aren't always as keen on? Sian?
So I think everything counts as wildlife, and things like parakeets with their sort of striking exoticism, and grey squirrels, also long ago kind of imported species, are quite important to engage people living in cities with nature. We'll always get things like the rats, the pigeons, the foxes that are adaptable and can live with whatever we throw at them. But if we make cities greener and better for a more diverse range of species, we'll notice them less, and there'll be a bit more natural competition, and it will feel more balanced.
Let's get into a bit of this sort of good, bad wildlife distinction we have. I mean, you mentioned urban foxes earlier on, Sian. A lot of people sort of feel that familiarity breeds contempt. And when we get a certain level of animals, when they become a nuisance in some ways, you know, they're making a racket at night, or they're pooping on our cars, if they're pigeons, people don't like them. Is it possible to get the balance right?
Firstly, I suspect that a lot of wildlife feels the same about humans. So I think there's a case for a bit more tolerance and acceptability.
But I mean, let's just take the pigeon. Is the pigeon actually doing anything for us or for wildlife? What's it doing that's useful in the city?
It's great food for peregrine falcons, which are an amazing adapter to cities, living on the top of high buildings, like the Tate Modern in London, a lot of churches in many cities.
So, yeah, they need pigeons to eat, do they?
Exactly, yeah. Exactly.
But how much of this is about us wanting to have our cake and eat it? Because it feels as though there's a part of this discussion which is we like wildlife when it looks pretty, when it's doing something cute, and it's somewhere close but not too close. And we like that. But as soon as it starts leaving waste, going through the bins, making noise at night, then we don't like it. And it's quite often they're the same animals. So how much of this is just sort of, humans have coexisted with animals for ages, but we're a bit hypocritical in what we want and when we want it?
If I can have a go at answering that.
Go on, Chris.
There's a word that I found myself coming to time and time again, which is conflict. And so much of this conversation for me comes down to managing and trying to reduce conflict, because this observation that Tom said about familiarity leading to contempt, often it is, like you said, foxes going through the bins. Nobody wants that. And if you live in the US, for example, you might have bears doing the same thing. You might have animals coming into your home, raiding your fridge, a badger in the shower, as we discussed already. I mean, these aren't situations that people want. And this is going to lead to conflict. And to go back to the question of what is wildlife, where I perhaps do differ from how other people look at this is that I can be a bit more critical of, is this a species that actually sits within an ecosystem, or is it just something that, as often happens with cities, you get animals coming to the city because, yes, they want to raid our bins.
Can you give me an example of both of those things? Sorry, what's fitting in an ecosystem and what's an invader?
Well, it can be the same species. I mean, to take a fox, for example, like if the fox is coming and going through the bins, then I would say, well, personally for me, it's not really part of a functioning ecosystem in that sense.
But hang on, waste food is part of the urban ecosystem. Surely that's how an awful lot of the creatures in our cities live.
This may be where I differ a little bit, because if the food is simply just our waste, then I'm not seeing that as a part of a functioning food chain. And I wouldn't. That's not a situation that I would encourage. If the fox is coming in and it's eating mice, rats, whatever, like other critters that happen to be in the urban landscape, then I would say, okay, this is a situation that is not so bad.
Okay, so you're basically saying that there are two systems that are operating in parallel. There's the human-built world where we have our own waste systems, our own water systems, and that exists. And then you think of it as there's an animal ecosystem that happens to inhabit the same place, but actually its functioning is entirely separate to the human, or should be. Okay, Sian, what do you think about that?
I think a study of urban foxes found that 80% of their diet was what you'd consider natural food. So I think it's a bit of a myth that all of their food comes from our waste. But obviously our waste does attract some unwanted species.
It depends on the fox, doesn't it? In Hammersmith Tube Station in London, there is a fox that quite regularly turns up at 9 p.m. to eat the chips that are left over. I'm pretty sure that fox has an entirely chip-based diet.
But by definition, Helen, you don't see it when it's off getting the rats. You only see it when it's eating the chips.
Well, if you speak to the station staff, it sounds like it gets through a lot of chips. I'm not sure it's got much room.
Dawn's keen to come in.
I'm keen to come in because we did that study. So, we looked at the diet of urban foxes using their whiskers. We did something called stable isotope analysis. So this gives us a history of what they've been eating. And we found that 30% of their diet, more than 30%, was originated from anthropogenic sources, which means basically what people have left out for them. So I do think it's more nuanced than what Chris is saying about it being separate. Humans and wildlife are interacting, they're coexisting. And I think actually we get a lot of benefit, mental health benefit and enrichment by engaging with wildlife. If we see it as separate, then it's not an urban system, it's not a combined coexistence. So I think there's a space there about how do we interact with these wildlife and how do they benefit from us? We're part of that ecosystem.
I mean, I'm kind of interested in this idea that wildlife is it seeing the city as the second best? There isn't a nice field with some trees and lots of food. And so, I'll have to, go and make my way in the city. Or is it the case that wildlife, and of course they're not sort of consciously expressing this, but is looking at a field, which is perhaps a bit barren and perhaps it's farm, it's had some pesticides on it, and they go, actually, look at all of that. There's big buildings, there's places to hide, there's no pesticides. This looks great. So, Dawn, is the city second best for a lot of these animals, or is it the prime choice?
So some animals do really well in cities because they can adapt to that habitat. So these are species that are typically generalist and they're flexible in their diet, and other animals can't do well. So it really depends on the species. But what you have, as you said, is a different area. You've got different resources, you've got places to hide, probably less risks maybe in some ways. So those species that can adapt do really well. So foxes and hedgehogs, they can actually be in higher numbers than in rural areas because they can exploit that area, but also they've got less competition. So it really is dependent on the species.
What's currently doing well, let's say in UK cities? I'm thinking about quite a few birds of prey, but maybe you can help me out, Dawn.
Well, I'm a mammal ecologist, so it's the example I give is about hedgehogs. So we know hedgehogs are doing better in suburban habitats than in rural. They're refuges for them. Those cities and those suburban areas are refuges. So even though they're declining in other areas, they seem to be doing okay in some areas of cities. Yeah.
Sian, what other species are doing well in urban areas in Britain?
So I guess looking beyond mammals, herring gulls. There are also studies that show urban ponds can be more biodiverse than rural ponds, so aquatic life as well.
So it's about frogs and fish and things like that. And why is that?
Good question. It's probably to do with management of the countryside, so intensive agriculture.
You're talking about pesticides and herbicides,
hedges.
are you?
Yeah. There are other birds that are quite successful. So, for example, swifts, still in serious decline, but are making quite a home for themselves in cities.
And birds of prey as well. We talked about falcons. I've also heard about red kites, just like they're making a recovery in the countryside, are also coming into our cities as well.
Absolutely. They're scavengers, so no doubt they can find plenty.
Chris, you've spent a lot of time looking at wildlife in different cities around the world. What are the things that make a city particularly good for wildlife or particularly bad for wildlife?
So if you want more animals, then I would say the main thing to be doing is to be focusing on the infrastructure that the animals can use in a holistic way so that they get their needs met by the urban environment.
So give us some examples of that.
So my focus in the book, looking at this, was in Nairobi, capital of Kenya, and Nairobi National Park, which is a wildlife reserve within the city. And that functions as a safe space for a whole range of animals, going right the way up to giraffe and zebra and lions and hippo. Even though they are right next to giant skyscrapers, they can live relatively happily. They have their needs met. And the key thing is they also have connectivity out of the city. So it's not a zoo. It's not like an isolated population where you're going to get excessive conflict or disease breaking out. It's part of a connected ecosystem. And the same principles apply, I would say, across the world, because if you want to look at a British city, European city, you want those safe spaces, those refuges, those habitats that different species can use. But then the connectivity that means that they're not trapped in one place.
So this is the thing
that we built.
That people say, for example, for hedgehogs, people recommend that you cut a hole in the bottom of a fence so that hedgehogs can go from garden to garden. It's that kind of thing. Sian?
Yeah, I'm really interested in gardens in particular, because if you think of looking down on a street of back gardens, it's like a linear park, and it can be a kind of wildlife highway potentially. between wider green spaces, cemeteries, school playing grounds, parks. So it's really critical habitat value. And it's also quite a large area. Gardens cover about a quarter of the land mass of a lot of UK cities, including London.
We're going to move on across the Atlantic now, actually, because earlier this year I was in the States for work and I was in Chicago and I heard that they consider themselves a bit of a thought leader when it comes to urban wildlife. And that's because in the beginning of the 20th century, they were aware that they were just sprawling everywhere without any gaps in between. And so the city authorities deliberately designated a proportion of future development that had to be green. It was around 10 or 11%. And so from then on, they've maintained their green areas, and I went to see one. I'm on the south side of Chicago, which has traditionally been the slightly rougher end of town, poorer districts, industrial neighbourhood. I'm right next to a freight train that can't seem to make up its mind which way it's going. It's been shunting back and forth for the last 5 minutes. But immediately beside me is a bit of wildland, and very close to this is a dedicated park. But the immediate surroundings are a marsh. This is Hegwish Marsh, and I'm with two people who are very, very keen about urban wildlife. Seth Magley, who's from Chicago Zoo, and also Jill Riddell, who's a writer and also has a podcast called The Shape of the World, all about urban wildlife. Seth, I'm going to start with you. Why have you brought me here?
I think this is a great example of the kinds of nature spaces that really exist across Chicago, and which increasingly people are starting to celebrate. These places where urban residents can connect to nature, see wildlife, see plants, and really kind of relax.
Jill, why does urban nature matter?
In the end, it's about health, it's about happiness, and it's also about the many ecological services that natural areas play.
So we're going to go for a bit of a walk?
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
So Hegwish Marsh is part of an area that's called the Calumet Open Space Reserve. It was an effort in the 1990s, early 2000s to take a look at this area of the city that's primarily industrial, and to think about ways where industry could be better mingled and better neighbors to nature. There are a lot of huge factories, industrial spaces. We're really close right now to the Ford Motor Company's, one of their very large plants is right next to us. And the thing that really attracts birders to this area in the spring is the warblers. So the migrating songbirds, it's almost like having a tropical aquarium in the sky with birds that are orange and they're red and they're brilliant yellow and they have incredible blue wings.
If we're lucky, maybe we'll spot a coyote. They are very common in this area. We could spot foxes, possum, maybe even skunks.
These wild spaces aren't just about the wild things, they're about getting people in here as well.
That's right. I think that philosophically, when you think about protecting spaces in the city, it's a little different than the way you might think far outside of human development. You know, we sometimes think of nature as something you set aside and you try to keep people away from. That kind of strategy, in my opinion, just does not work in the city. We need people to celebrate this space. We sometimes think of cities as these spaces that are devoid of wildlife. That's true nowhere. Every city is a form of nature. Every city has interesting biodiversity. We have the simplistic narrative of protecting wildlife where cities are the villains. The cities are the bad guys. Nothing good can happen in this city. You have to go as far from it as you can. The problem with that narrative, one of the problems with that narrative is it's failing us, right? We are not succeeding in protecting biodiversity on our planet. And I believe, and others like me believe, that we need to flip the script or at least make it more complicated and think of how do we make cities part of the solution.
Hang on, Jill's pointing at something. What are you pointing at, Jill?
I see a little bird that's creeping along the trunk of that tree over there. I'm going to pull out the binoculars and just see what that is. Do you see this?
Looks like a black-capped chickadee to me. They're pretty common around here, but they're very cool.
So it's about the size of a blackbird, I'd say, for the UK audience. It's grey with a sort of whiter, lighter underbelly, a black head and some white flashes. How am I doing on my description?
That's a very nice description. I would add one thing. Chickadees actually have ultraviolet streaks on their cheeks that we can't see, but they can see in each other.
I thought I heard a blue jay earlier, but I'm not hearing it now. They just have a very distinctive call.
Can you do it for me?
Well,
put you on the spot.
You know, birders like to use turn them into words. That's a good way to sort of remember them. I don't know what language is appropriate for your podcast, but I've always been told that they sort of go, jackass. So that's how I'm familiar with calling
Now I know what to listen for.
Yes. Climate change will bring new species to this area that don't live there now. Something I've been saying recently, I think people think that I'm insane, is that we will have armadillos in Chicago before too long because they are in the southern part of our state. They are slowly migrating north. Someday, probably even in my lifetime, I think, you will probably look around and see armadillos in the city, but no one wants to plan for them because no one believes me. We have muskrats, we have beavers. The beavers are quite good at adapting to urban life when we tolerate them, but they're a challenge, right? Beavers knock down trees. We don't always like it when they knock down trees. I was in a meeting some years back with a woman from the Park District who was in tears because the beavers had torn down several memorial trees that were planted for people who had died. I think in the city we have to think a little bit differently about nature. In some ways we have to take it where we find it and really see what the animals are responding to more than maybe our own biases about what we think makes a good nature space. And to that end, I want to point out we've been talking a lot about these protected green spaces that the Park District has and the forest preserves, and they're fantastic. But my team also monitors wildlife in more opportunistic spaces like cemeteries and golf courses, and they turn out to be remarkable wildlife habitat in many cases, even though they were not built with that in mind.
Well, this is Rare Earth on BBC Radio 4, and this week we're talking about the wildlife that's all around us in towns and cities. And with us to discuss all of that, we have Dawn Scott from Nottingham Trent University, Chris Fitch, who's the author of Wild Cities, and Sean Moxon, who's the founder of the campaign group Rewild My Street.
Well, at the end of that report from Chicago, we were hearing from Seth, who's from Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. And one of the things he was saying to me beforehand is some of his colleagues who study exotic things, I don't know, like, snow leopards in the Himalayas or ibex in Africa, look at him strangely and say, why is he studying raccoons in the local garbage patch? Dawn, can you relate to that issue of why this urban wildlife is important?
What people see in their back gardens, what they come across on the sort of everyday is really important in terms of that connection with nature. And we can go to exotic places and see exotic things, but actually what is in our own back garden needs to be looked after as well.
But it isn't just because it's nice, right? I mean, there are studies which demonstrate that for mental health, for example, this is beneficial. There's been talk about green prescribing on the NHS, that actually encouraging people to spend time in nature has a very direct benefit on their health. So, Sean, what kind of other direct benefits do we see?
So it's good for our stress levels. It lowers the stress hormone cortisol, for example, and our heart rate. You're more likely to have social interactions if you've got nice green spaces to meet people in.
I would say the only time I talk to people in the park is when there's some animals doing something that so there were chicks in the coot nest, for example, and everyone's gathered around having a chat about the coots.
Chris, you've actually got this in the very introduction of your book as something you felt primally yourself and something I think you termed biophilia.
Well, I can't claim credit for the term. That's been around for a while. But yes, biophilia is just that love of nature. And I would certainly subscribe to the theory. And I don't know if anyone else on the show, if anyone would disagree. I feel like all people have this natural desire to be around nature. There is something that happens when people are in a space, not necessarily a landscaped space, but one that is very natural, one where there is an abundance of life in all different forms. And there's so many examples where people are able to concentrate more. Or there was even a famous study where people who were in a hospital, and if they could see nature outside of their window, they actually healed faster and went home faster. It's an abundance of research which is showing again and again that, yes, we like being around nature. And exactly as Dawn was saying, the beauty of urban nature is it democratizes that for everyone. It doesn't make it something that you have to be able to fly around the world and go to some extravagant, exotic place to find.
Really everyone, or is it often for those who live in the wealthier parts of the city? Chris?
That is, of course, an important factor, that we even talk about cities as being leafier if you're talking about the wealthier areas. I mean, we understand immediately what that means. So, yes, I would argue that we want our cities to be universally greener. We want it to be something that is available for everyone.
Well, I've got a big bee in my bonnet about that, because one of my pet hates is new developments calling new streets something gardens when there's nothing green in it. And I think there should be a rule that you are not allowed to call a street or a square something gardens unless it's at least 70% green stuff or something for wildlife. It really bugs me. There's this kind of lip service paid to, oh, well, we want to live in a garden, so we'll just call it gardens and then it will all be okay.
Or
and
it's something meadow or something glade.
Yeah.
It always strikes me it's named after what they destroyed in order to put it there.
Exactly.
Sean, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just to echo that there is a phenomenon of green gentrification where, we make places greener and it displaces communities that have been there before. So I think we do have to be mindful in cities of equity of access to nature and in terms of planning where new green spaces go. Also with biodiversity net gain, which came in recently, whereby all new building developments in England have to increase biodiversity on site from where they found it by 10%. So that is hopefully going in the right direction.
Okay, well, let's move on to thinking about, we've mentioned that certain species are adaptable and that's why they do well in cities. But I'm interested in whether there are more specific ways that wildlife has adapted to cities, perhaps changing what they eat, changing the song they sing or when they sing it. Presumably, this mostly concrete-filled environment these animals have to adapt somehow. So, Dawn, what sort of things are they doing to adapt?
Well, I'm going to pick up on the point there about the bird song, because there was quite a famous study about looking at bird song in urban environments and that they were singing a different tune to try and shout over the sound of the traffic and the noise. So that was really, really interesting. But we've also got loads of different adaptations. In terms of thinking about an urban area as a different structure, all the animals have to adapt to that. Behaviourally, they adapt. They change the time of activity. They change the group size. They change what they eat, and all they're doing is adapting to that landscape, that urban landscape. There's also some suggestion that actually changing potentially their physiology as well as their behaviour.
Go on. In what way?
So there was a study done recently looking at foxes again, looking at the shape of the skull of animals that are in an urban environment. And there was a slight change in terms of potentially the skull morphology. I think there's a lot more evolution to go, but it was just a suggestion that actually maybe we are creating, a slight change in terms of species and their behaviour or physiology to adapt to us.
But what might be the advantage of a fox having one skull shape rather than another?
So it is probably difficult to say exactly, but obviously they're utilising a different diet, and as we found, there about 30% of their food is coming from humans, and so that association might be that there's something beneficial in terms of that jaw size.
I'm quite fascinated by this, really. Is it about squeezing through tiny spaces, gaps in the railings, or
snarling at cats?
It's, the suggestion from the paper, from the researchers, was that it might be that it was more dog-like. And so it was suggestion that there was a potential domestication, but that takes a very, very long time, and I don't think there's a lot more to do around there. So it was just how are animals adapting to us in different ways.
Chris, are there international examples of that? You've looked at a lot of different cities.
Yes, this question of adaptation is one that comes up over and over again, and I kind of identify some cases which they sort of get idealized a little bit. I'm a bit wary of them. I see it as a sort of pseudo adaptation. For example, if you're in Japan, you go to the city of Nara, and very famously you have these huge numbers of sika deer which wander around on the streets. Yeah,
I've seen them.
Did you feed them by any chance?
No, I found it a little bit icky.
Okay, well, could you elaborate on that? Because I feel the same, but I haven't been there.
It was a sort of false wildness for a start, and they smelt, and I sort of felt the whole thing was a rather unhealthy relationship, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. False wildness, like you say, it's not necessarily a very healthy relationship. You're going to get these animals dependent on people. You can get disease. I wouldn't recommend it.
Well, it's probably time we came to the downsides, real or perceived, of wildlife, because I think quite often wildlife is seen as an inconvenience. For example, in Hong Kong, they now have extremely heavy fines and even jail terms for feeding wildlife. They clearly feel that there are massive downsides to wildlife in cities, and they are penalising people for encouraging wildlife. And we heard in that recording from Chicago, there's this tension between wanting wildlife and not necessarily liking what it does. So I'm interested in how we see our relationship with wildlife. And it can be that wildlife is seen as inconvenient. It's kind of unpredictable and messy, and it gets in the way.
Dawn, can there be too many herring gulls in our towns and cities? Or are they always a good thing?
There can be too many of anything, and I think different people have different perceptions in terms of tolerance and wildlife. And I've got examples where I've talked to people in two different neighbours, and one neighbour loves the animals and feeds the foxes, the next neighbour hates it. So we can't generalise, but what we can do is look at what solutions there are for when that conflict occurs to try and change that conflict into coexistence. You have to look at both opinions and then try and come up with a solution.
Sean?
I think another thing that's interesting in terms of attitudes is this idea of the messiness of nature and people's tolerance or lack of for that. In all areas of cities, but particularly in gardens, where gardening is about control, and people expect a certain amount of stewardship and care. As an architect, I think design is really important to present nature nicely, if you like, so contrasting it with geometry, framing it with boundaries that are more built and designed can be really
see the architectural drawing now. but it's this thing of control, I think, is really interesting. So we asked around on social media before this programme what examples there were of people finding little havens for wildlife in their local area. And one of the things that came up was when a tree falls down or is cut down, that you leave it there. And there's this phrase, phoenix tree, because it's going to, if not quite rise from the ashes, it will provide a habitat for lots of wildlife. And yet, for most people, if you cut down a tree, that's then a mess to be cleared up. And yet, actually, potentially, that is the foundation of a whole little ecosystem, if you can just let it be.
Absolutely. Decaying wood is a really vital habitat for beetles and all sorts of kind of creepy crawlies that then feed more impressive things higher up the food chain. So creating a little log pile is a great thing to do to make a difference in your own garden.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes, please do, Chris.
So I've written down that expression, phoenix tree. Somehow I hadn't come across that before, but I adore it. But we heard from your piece in Chicago, Tom, about the value of cemeteries and these sort of unplanned natural places becoming very important hotspots for biodiversity in the city. And this is something that I saw time and time again. But it makes me think about the example of one of the most highly publicized and promoted and copied examples of urban rewilding that's happened in recent decades, which is the High Line in New York. It used to be a passageway in and out of the meatpacking district, and then it closed down in the 80s.
It's a railway. It's an elevated railway line, or was an elevated railway line.
Exactly, sorry. And then time passed without it being used, and different species moved in and began creating this little ecology, and this ecosystem emerged. And then people rediscovered it and said, well, this is a wonderful thing that nobody planned, and has now become this hugely celebrated tourist attraction of New York. So these pockets of nature can come out of the most unexpected places, and they become hugely celebrated.
Although the High Line is quite an interesting example, because actually quite a lot of it has been sort of re-urbanized. I think it doesn't look, large parts of it don't look very wild anymore. There's a walkway that goes through, it's got sort of bollards and things to stop scooters and stuff. People have been given access, but as a result, it's now a compromised space, I think.
We can't let go, it seems.
Dawn?
Sometimes you see, these amenity grasslands or football pitches. Unfortunately, they're not very biodiverse. We don't really see animals going onto them. But you go into a cemetery at night, as I've done multiple times, and you see badger cubs playing and running around. So, these are green spaces. This is part of our urban environment as well.
I'm impressed at your ability to find badgers wherever you are. Sounds brilliant. I wish I had that superpower.
Well, let's look to the future. Sian Moxham, you are founder of Rewild My Street. What role does rewilding have to play in our urban futures?
So a really big role, I think, to make this happen, starting from where we live. So Rewild My Street is a project that aims to inspire and guide urban residents to make small changes to their outdoor spaces to help wildlife and therefore make them better themselves too.
Like what?
We send out monthly wild makeover tips, and the one at the moment was to leave your leaves. So if you're sweeping up fallen autumn leaves from the paths or lawns, great, but put them on your soil where they'll create lots of cover for hedgehogs, creepy crawlies overwintering, and then the worms will take them down naturally into the soil and enrich your soil for next year as well.
Somebody mentioned to me tub ponds, which I hadn't heard of, but were just sort of putting a small basin of water or something out as a little refuge, which is it's very small and simple. You don't have to dig a great big pond, right?
Yeah, so I call it a bee bowl, and it's one of our most popular tips, but you could just get like a shallow dish, like a saucer from a plant pot or something, put in some pebbles and then put in water or allow it to fill with rainwater. And this helps pollinators and other insects that need somewhere to sort of perch while they're having a drink so that they don't drown if they're kind of going into a pond or a bird bath.
But forgive me, is this really rewilding, or are you just using it because it's a sexy term? Most of the things you mentioned are quite small. I mean, do you actually have ambitions to make cities truly wilder in a way that people are going to notice?
Yes, I think rewilding means something quite different in a rural context to an urban context. For me, in an urban context, it's anything that adds greenery and water that makes cities more inhabitable for different species of wildlife.
But when we're talking about, a city is a big thing, it's got big concrete things everywhere. Are a few bowls of water really going to make a difference? I mean, how much is it these little small things that individuals could do? And how much is it up to the councils and the city planners to actually build this in properly?
It needs to come from both levels, both bottom up from residents and top down from governments and planners and so on. And I think it can make a huge difference. And studies have showed that providing homes for wildlife, providing food for wildlife, providing water for wildlife does make a difference in terms of numbers and biodiversity of species.
I want to come on to what our new housing developers should do. But just before I do, Chris, I was wondering if you had some good examples from around the world of rewilded cities.
Yes, we have people showing quite a lot of ambition to have nature and particularly animals in the city. Somewhere like Singapore is extremely good with having bridges that cross over the highways, which allow the movement of wildlife. And just outside Los Angeles, next year, there's going to be the opening of the world's largest wildlife crossing, the Wallace-Allenberg wildlife crossing, which is to allow the mountain lions there to be able to move around the landscape. There was a very famous mountain lion called P22, which became quite famous for getting stuck in Griffith Park there in LA.
The poor thing didn't even get an imaginative name. It just got called P22, really. Yeah,
it's like the number became a bit more exciting to people after it had been given out. But yeah, a proper name would have been nice. But yeah, I think because he became such a celebrity, it sort of raised the plight of these animals getting stuck in the urban landscape, find themselves having to sort of make a dash across a 10-line highway. The story of this individual animal surviving in such an extremely urban environment really raised awareness of this as an issue and became a sort of powerful factor to get politicians and philanthropists to work together to do something that would make a difference. And this spread of wildlife crossings and wildlife tunnels around the world. If you go to Porto Alegre in Brazil, there's this program called Macacos Urbanos, which is urban monkeys. And it's about having cables and ropes across the street to allow the monkeys to get around without them being hit by cars. A lot of it's about avoiding cars because roads are kind of everywhere.
Well, let's come back to Tom's point about the designing. If there's a new build, Sian, if there's a development, what are the sorts of things that could or should be built into developments to give humans and animals a chance to coexist happily?
Things like integrated bricks or eaves nest boxes for swifts that create places for them to live.
So just describe what one of those looks like.
Swifts like a nesting spot that's high up. Often you just see a hole within the sort of facade of the building because they can be very much built in, formed as a sort of large brick or something. And so often you don't see much, but they provide a place where swifts who have got a lack of homes can have their young. Things like bat tiles, where you have a slightly elevated roof tile that creates a little crevice for for sleeping bats.
So you're making a gesture to imply there's a sort of bump in the roof tile that then leaves a space underneath that a bat could crawl into.
So the thing is, historic buildings used to have a lot of these gaps and so on naturally, and would create these sort of accidental nesting spaces for animals. But increasingly, as we make them more airtight, which we need to do for climate change and insulation, they have less of those kind of accidental spaces, so we need to design them in.
One of the things about all this is that, of course, we're talking about built and not built, so there was no space in between. But Tom, you found a really interesting example of this thing I hadn't heard of called a meanwhile garden, which I thought was just brilliant.
Meanwhile gardens is this idea that there are lots of places within cities which are a little bit derelict. But if you go to the owner and say, can I turn this into a park or a garden? They say no, because I'm intending to develop it in the future, which is kind of reasonable, I guess. So people have now come on and said, OK, but in the meanwhile, can I create a garden there? And that meanwhile could be 1, 2, 3, 7 years. And people have put planters in there, they put skips in there, they put things full of soil and actually made a pretty vibrant natural habitat. Sean?
There's a fabulous initiative in Paris where you can apply for a permit if you find a sort of spot of unused land. You can apply for a permit to garden it yourself, basically.
You don't have to go to Paris. You can do it in Hull. They have a right to grow. You can go to the council and say that bit of land, you have to come up with a good reason why I'm not allowed to grow something there.
Sadly, yes, our cities are going grey. So although gardens cover a quarter of a lot of cities, it's becoming increasingly not green space, but grey space. There are some frightening statistics that 1 in 10 of us have changed our lawn to artificial grass, and 1 in 4 of us have paved over our front garden for a car parking space. And a study a little while ago in London actually found that every year we lose the equivalent of 2.5 Hyde Parks worth of green space in London through those kind of changes.
I saw this stat and it was one of those ones that I was absolutely gobsmacked by. So I went and had a look at the background. It does seem to be fairly robust. The only thing, because it was sort of in the noughties, wasn't it? This
2010.
Up to 2010, wasn't it? I wondered if it was the height of the decking craze that made it a particular era for getting rid of grass and putting hard stuff in.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to have an update, but it probably wouldn't be great because it probably would say the same story, particularly as those statistics about the artificial lawns and the front gardens are much more recent nationwide survey.
Looking ahead, what are the things, Dawn, if you could change something a city does or a city planner does or what individuals do, what would you change to give wildlife and humans a better chance to coexist?
That's a good question. And I think Sean mentioned it in terms of some of that intelligent sort of thinking in terms of planning and modification. So I think having some form of legislation around what we should be doing. But I think you won't get that unless the general public realise and want it and really are behind it. So I think that biodiversity net gain is a step, but I think we need to do a bit more.
Chris, what would your recommendation be for authorities or individuals to help nature?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. You can look to London, which has declared itself to be a national park city. And at the same time, you want to have communities speaking from the bottom up and being able to say, yes, I want to, exactly like Sean was saying, rewild my street. I want to have a wilder garden, and to put pressure on from below. When they can meet, that's sort of the sweet spot where you'll actually get meaningful change happening.
And Sean, what would you change?
I'd like people to start with their own outdoor space, however small, whether that's a window box, a balcony or a garden, and to make it just a little bit wilder one step at a time.
Well, thank you very much to all our guests. Dawn Scott from Nottingham Trent University, Chris Fitch, author of Wild Cities, and Sean Moxon from London Metropolitan University and founder of Rewild My Street.
Well, I've got a whole load of ideas in my head, but the one that is going to stick with me is the idea of armadillos in Chicago. I was really struck by a sentence from that piece about cities being seen as villains. And that is so often the assumption that when it comes to wildlife, cities are kind of a necessary evil. But it does seem as though there's quite a lot of potential for, if we rethink a city, that doesn't have to be true.
I think that's right. However, I think we can't get away from the fact, you mentioned this, you say we always want to control. I sort of think that's reasonable in a city because its primary function is a space for us to live and work. I don't think we can get away from the maybe a harsh truth that nature is going to play second fiddle to us. Having said that, I think it can be very close, and I think we can do a lot to accommodate nature and make our living spaces work well for both.
I think there's a sort of wider point here, which is that we always forget that we are all dependent on the natural world. Like, you know, it supplies us with air to breathe and with food. We're part of it. We're not separate to it. And I think there might be something about sort of a bit of humility when it comes to cities. I take your point that we are going to want to control our own living spaces, and perhaps we don't want rats and hedgehogs exactly in our kitchen. And, I get that. But I do also think that there's a sort of healthy reminder that we are part of something bigger. And I think that's part of the appeal of wildlife, that even if we don't want it all in our kitchen, we clearly take comfort in still being connected to it.
Talking of kitchens, I don't know if I'm giving too much away. You have some wildlife very, very close to your kitchen.
Oh, yeah.
You keep worms in your flat, in a wormery, and they, in their own little wormery, are in their own wild space. But you don't like it when they get out of the wormery, and I don't blame you.
No.
But my point is, so it's a controlled ecosystem, and I think in a way a city is a macrocosm of what you've got in your own kitchen.
It could well be. And it is always the case that when you occasionally get up in the morning and there is one inevitably dead worm dried up somewhere on the floor a little away from the worm bin, I've no idea how they get out. But the nice thing about the worm bin, there's many nice things about it, is that it's a reminder that the food scraps go somewhere, they get processed, and that compost goes in the planters, which then grow tomatoes for next year. That reminder that we are part of a system, I think that's really important.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Rare Earth. It was produced by Emma Campbell and was a BBC audio production in association with the Open University.
And in an exclusive interview with the Open University, wildlife cameraman Hamza Yassin shares his advice on how we can all help wildlife, even in our towns and cities. Visit the BBC Rare Earth homepage and follow the links to the Open University to listen to that.
Join us again next week when we'll be talking about the fastest, most efficient and greenest ways to get around our towns and cities.
That was me, Chris Fitch, on the BBC Radio 4 Rare Earth podcast. I don't normally come on to add anything after the show has ended, but I decided that this would be a good opportunity to do the thing that you often get from your podcasts where people say, could you rate us? And I don't normally want to be that guy, but if you did want to give me a rating, that would be quite nice. That would help turn this podcast into more of a thing and help some podcast fans find it. The other thing that I do need to say is, for anyone who has bought a copy of the book, it is amazing if you can leave online reviews. I know it's a bit tacky and icky sometimes, but Amazon, Goodreads, or wherever you're able to leave a review, it is unfortunately what a lot of the websites respond to. So, if you've enjoyed the book and you wouldn't mind giving a nice 4 or 5 star rating, that would be amazing. I really think a lot of the time it's not so much the ratings that books have that people use to judge if they're good or not. It's actually how many reviews they got, because most books get somewhere between high 3s and high 4s in terms of stars. And that's where this book is. Wild Cities, it's kind of low 4 in Goodreads and like high 4 in Amazon, and that's great. But it's not based on very many reviews, and I really feel like you can have 2 books with the same star rating, but if one of them's based on 10 reviews and one of them's based on 10,000, that's really the thing that makes a difference, much more than what the rating actually is. It's just if there's been a lot of reviews given, then people feel it's something they should pay attention to. So, small thing, if you are able to quickly whip out your phone and throw a quick review or a star rating, on the book or indeed of this podcast, I would be extremely grateful. No idea when the next episode is coming, but hopefully I will have some new material coming down the line soon. But I'll probably wrap up 2025 to say thanks so much for your support again, and have a wonderful new year.